Hello and welcome to Lands Unknown. My name is Will, and today we are going to look at the polity chart, which is an idea that I was developing since working on the Worldbuilding Festival with Bib. This stream is pre-recorded. It is also showing you a work in progress. I'm going to keep it in line with this stream, so there are going to be very minimal editing here. I mean, I may pause it to take a breath or something throughout the video, but otherwise, it's going to be more like a live. I've also called this a Marginalia, so this is like the notes in the margins. It's kind of just emphasizing how this is more informal and a bit more of like a work in progress. So let's kind of bring this up here, and there we go. All right. So as I mentioned, when I was discussing Worldbuilding States and Polities with Bib at the Worldbuilding Festival last year, I talked about different concepts that we can apply to talk about polities. And I did this in service of describing what a state is and how states are distinct from other kinds of polity. And here we have, a definition or a description of a state, which puts together a lot of the common ideas that scholars have when we talk about states. So it's a hierarchical polity composed of centralized organizations that deploy violence to enforce the legal order over a population within a given politically autonomous territory. And through that, I broke down 5 concepts, talked about the difference between like hierarchy and other forms of political organization within a polity, talked about stratification, talked about centralization, territoriality, and coercion and negotiation or consensus. And so I took those and I added one more concept to kind of create 6 axes. So each of the axes goes across from one side of the rim to the other side of the rim. And so, each of these axes asks a different question. Are institutions centralized within one structure or decentralized throughout many? Are relations between different elements of the society more anarchic or more hierarchic? Is power more concentrated or is it diffuse? Are groups in society stratified? So are segments broken up into different strata that have different privileges? Or is it non-stratified, where people are more equal to one another? Is the polity territorial? So it has a fixed territory with, fixed like territorial insertions or jurisdictions inside it? Or is it non-territorial? Is the territory more inclusive, more diffuse? Are there multiple polities that overlap or share specific territories? And then, the final one is the normative order. So the way that the polity imagines things ought to be. Is that order coerced? So is it imposed with physical force or violence? Or is it negotiated? Is it something that has to be is it more bilateral or multilateral? And the method for this, I also added color because I think the color helps communicate some of the ideas here. So we have a warm spoke and a cool spoke for each of the axes. And there's a cool half of this wheel. The cool half is more associated. There's a cool half and a warm half. Each spoke is broken into 5 steps that are differentiated by saturation. So at the inner hub is 20% saturation, and then it increases by 20 each time. So 40, 60, 80, and then 100 is the outer step along the rim. The cool spokes, as I mentioned, comprise the top half. The warm spokes are the bottom. The cool spokes are associated with state and state-like polities. Meanwhile, the warm spokes are associated with more egalitarian non-state polities. Though you could totally have an unstate polity that largely takes up the cool half. And I do have some examples later that I kind of plotted on this to a greater or lesser degree. We can see how that works out. While we did split up this wheel into warm and cool spokes, they're not exclusive. So you can plot a polity, but if you plot if you plot a polity on the rim of the warm spoke of the axis, or it precludes plotting on the cool spokes of other axes and vice versa. So if you make a polity 100% concentrated, so that would be, in the step of the spoke that is most on the rim in the northeast of the circle here by the compass rose. I may use that to refer to different things just because it's more, just another thing to kind of navigate by on the chart. So 100% concentrated means that a society can't be decentralized, or can't be significantly decentralized. Similarly, if you mark a polity, it's 100% non-stratified. So non-stratified there being southeast, it means the society cannot be hierarchic, right? If you have a totally non-stratified society, you're not going to be able to have a hierarchy. If you have a society that is less non-stratified, then there can be room for more hierarchic organization in some parts of the polity. But if you're at 100%, then that's kind of exclusive. So these 6 axes ask different questions. The centralized decentralized axis asks how integrated institutions are in the polity. The hierarchic anarchic axis asks how do elements in society relate to one another. The concentrated diffuse axis asks how political power is distributed throughout the polity. So, who can engage with and influence decision-making in groups. Then you have the stratified to non-stratified, which is how equal are members of the polity. And this can be both how equally, but this is more in line with what privileges different groups in society have. And this can include things like differences in material wealth. And that's the distinction with concentrated and diffuse. So concentrated diffuse is how many, is power held in the hands of the few? Is it held in the hands of the many? If few people are actually engaged in political decisions, are they elected? Are they accountable? Can they be recalled? Those sorts of things. Meanwhile, stratification is there a strata of society that cannot be involved in politics? Like the way that slaves are commonly excluded from making political decisions. Though, there are societies where there are slaves, but the slaves are very important in, say, administration or warfare and those sorts of things. But oftentimes, they're not making the political decisions. They are executing those decisions. Then we have how the polity is spatialized. That's territorial or non-territorial. And then the coercion to negation axis asks, how is the normative order maintained? And I may change it to coercion to consensus, with negotiation being more in the middle. There needs to be some work there. Yeah, just kind of now running through each of these 6 axes. So how integrated are institutions in the polity? On the centralized side, centralized polities embed institutions within a small number of structures. So, you would have one public government, for example, and that public government then has different governing apparatus that handle different things. But if you want to do politics, you have to do it through that. There are societies where there are different political decisions that are made by different political bodies that are autonomous from one another and they don't really influence one another. You could also have more hierarchical societies where you've got a you've got a monarchy. You also have a separate council, which the monarch sometimes engages with. You could also then have, a variety of temples, and those temples all have a role to play in the political situation. So the way that the politics in society is actually fractured and broken up. So it could still be centralized, where you do have these loci of power, or loci of power, the centers of power. But it's still, there's still a handful of these structures. Meanwhile, decentralized polities disperse governing institutions across different organizations, and different segments and networks in society. So, you could have kin groups making some political decisions, and then you would have local groups. So, these people would be people who are living together across different kin groups making decisions. You can also have solidarity networks or solidarity societies. Popular ones that people have heard of would be like ritual societies or warrior societies. There's also like men's and women's societies. And these societies are also making political decisions about things that those societies specifically deal with. Though in the case of things like a warrior society, for example, if we're thinking about the Cheyenne, those were segments of society that would have rotating duties, which the community would essentially assign to them, or that were traditionally practiced. So, they weren't necessarily making those political decisions. The community as a whole would be making political decisions, and then the warrior society would be fulfilling their obligations to make sure that the normative order or the decisions that the community made through consensus were actually being followed after the fact. More decentralized societies tend to have more of these institutions. As a society starts to centralize, like states start centralizing, and these more state-like apparatus mediate. They try to centralize in order to mediate relationships. They also try to centralize things in order to make relationships legible to the state, so that they can be, policed essentially, or taxed, or what have you. All right, and then we have the hierarchic to anarchic scale. So this is how elements in society relate to one another. On the hierarchic end, for 60% plus, elements are in relations of domination and subordination. So when you look at how society is structured, some elements are dominant and they impose rules, or the normative order, or they impose decisions, let's say, upon other elements in society. On the other end, from the 60% step to 100%, you have anarchies, and in anarchic societies, different segments relate to each other horizontally. So you have a horizontal relation of these different segments. Meanwhile, heterarchic societies have multiple potential rankings for elements in relation to one another. So in a heterarchic society, you could have, either different elites, and these elites relate to each other differently depending on the situation. You can also have different institutions, and those institutions relate to each other differently, or different networks. So, for example, if people belonged to extended family groups, say everyone lives in lodges, and then they also have clan groups, which could be a moiety, or it could be a broader political affiliation. Sometimes their clan could be more important, and sometimes their lodge could be more important. And if they live in a context where there are multiple different lodges and clans living together, then that spatial polity or institution network could be more important, right? So in a more hierarchic society, those jurisdictions are organized, you know, top down, where some are subordinate to others. So, for example, like in Canada, um, cities are creatures of the province. So the provincial government gets to do whatever it wants to cities. Like it can uh, change districts for voting, for example, if it wanted to meddle in local elections. It can change the extent of a city. You know, it takes, you know, municipalities can vote to amalgamate and those sorts of things. But like if the province doesn't want to happen, then the province could stop it. So yeah, you have that, you know, distinct top-down organization where the municipality is subject to the province. And you know, for anarchies, you know, elements may relate horizontally, but some may take priority over others. Some may be more important than one another's in certain circumstances. You know, that's why we start getting more towards a more hierarchic situation as we get towards the 40%. Though, I mean, it may be the 60%. I mean, I'll return to this later, but maybe 5 steps is too many. I think 3 steps on each side may be good enough. All right, and the next one is how is political power distributed through the polity? Polities that concentrate power place authority to make decisions in the hands of the few. So when you get up into like the, you know, more saturated 80 and 100% sections, you have unaccountable elites who control political decisions, and you have a small number of them. So, you know, this is where we would start to see things like, you know, the actual absolute monarchies and stuff like that, or, you know, these authoritarian dictatorships where, you know, you have a handful of people who are imposing decisions. Segments in society in concentrated polities are also, segmented societies, so stratified societies also tend to be more concentrated. So you do tend to have exclusion as well. So, you know, we could say that a society like what's a common one? Like Athens, for example, there were citizens, and citizens made up a decent amount of the polity, but I mean they were specifically men, right? Adult men of the citizen state participated in politics. So that would probably relate, you know, lower on the concentrated end, because, you know, during certain periods of time in Athens, regardless of what kind of citizen you were, you could participate in the political situation. Meanwhile, in more diffuse polities, you have power relations spread throughout the membership of the polity. So more people are members of the political community. And when you start getting closer to the hub, there may be members of the community who are representative in political decision-making processes. However, those people are recallable, right? They're still accountable and they are still chosen. Meanwhile, you know, again, thinking about Canada, it'd be more concentrated. You know, technically, any citizen can, you know, participate in a variety of different political offices. However, once they're voted in, they're kind of unaccountable to the constituency that voted them, right? Like they can say they're going to do a bunch of things, but once they get into office, they don't have to do it. They don't even have to stay in the party that they were voted into, because you're voting for the member. You're not voting for a party. Parties aren't part of the Canadian Constitution, well, even though they're a part of the political system. So, you know, this is, you know, a bit more concentrated because, you know, the power and the ability to make political decisions starts becoming more unaccountable. Meanwhile, in more diffuse societies, Even when they're less, even in diffuse societies, even when they are less diffuse and more decision making power is invested in a smaller number of people, they are still accountable to that community, so they can have their power stripped from them, and it could be delegated to someone else. All right, the next one here is asking how equal are members of the polity. So on the one end, we have stratified. On the other end, we have non-stratified. Stratified polities divide society into distinct groups or strata that have different privileges. And what we are kind of most interested in is privileges as they relate to decision making. So like political privileges, so people's ability to be involved in their polities. However, social mobility, socioeconomic status, and the gulfs between those are highly associated with political access. So, you could have a society where technically all citizens are equal and you don't have, slaves in the polity, but you can have people with a lot of material wealth, and with that material wealth, they are much more involved in politics. So that would still be a stratified society that we would care about. Those societies that are in the 80 or the 100% would tend to be societies where there is very little, if any, mobility between strata. And this would also be something like a caste society, something like that, or a society where you have a large body of slaves, or a society where you have many different strata that are all distinguished from one another. So, you could have a society with very little stratification. You could have where the elites aren't too distinct from the commons, but there is a actual distinction there. You can also have a society where most people are elites, and I think I mentioned this before, but for example, in the Pacific Northwest coast, this includes the Coast Salish, as well as like the Kwakwaka'wakw and the Haida, and other groups like that. Their societies tended to be like they are stratified societies, but they weren't a pyramid. They were like an upside down pear, where a majority of people in those societies were elites. So that would be something that would be minimally stratified. Though there was variation, of course. In the South, you tended to have a society where most people were elites, and you had very few slaves. As you move further north, you still had a lot of elites, but then you also had, maybe a third or a quarter of the population of the large villages that were inhabited for parts of the year could be slaves. This is something else that so that may be that would be more stratified, but the system is most people are elites, and elites in that system are people who have a ancestral relationship to the land, and they have essentially titles that grant them collective ownership to the land and specific and sort of usufruct or priority rights to different properties in the territory. The non-elites, who are also not slaves, the common folks, they were people who were not slaves, but also didn't have long-term relationships with the land. And what would usually happen is you would get enough of these commons in an area in different communities. And once you had enough of them, they would come together and form their own distinct polity. And then they would essentially become the elites. So there was still like social mobility. Like someone could be, a migrant to an area, be a commoner, and then, join up with a bunch of other commoners, go to an area, establish their own village site, and become an elite. So it is stratified, but these are more minimally stratified societies. On the other hand, you have non-stratified societies. In non-stratified societies, you don't have ranks with distinct privileges. These strata, and the strata themselves are ranked. People within the strata are ranked. Instead, you have status. And status is something that can be achieved. It can be bestowed or granted. Status can also be something that is inherited. And in more non-stratified societies, this achievement or bestowal of status is pretty transient. It's just something that kind of is bestowed in someone's lifetime for what they do, or like if there's a specific project that needs to happen. Usually we can think of status as, in a hunter-gatherer, an egalitarian hunter-gatherer community, they want to go on a hunt. And they say, oh, well, so-and-so can lead the hunt. They're 6 years old, and they've gone on a lot of successful hunts, so they should lead the hunt, right? Like, then when the hunt is over, that is done. The other thing that they could say is, if they're on a hunt and they bestow the status of leader for the hunt and the hunt isn't going well, they can kind of take it back and then give it to somebody else and say, well, we're not going to listen to you. Clearly, it's not your day. Or, the person who has the status can give it to someone else. They can say, well, I'm having an off day, they're tilting. And so they can grant it to someone else instead. In vertically egalitarian societies, there are limited segments in society who can achieve certain statuses. And this would, again, be something more like the Cheyenne or the Haudenosaunee, where there are certain ancestries, certain lineages, who traditionally inherit the position of political leader. These political leaders still have to generate consensus in order to make decisions. They don't impose decisions on people. They're not hierarchic. They still have to kind of organize decision making. Yeah, they still have to organize decision making through consensus. It's still highly negotiated. It is like a multilateral thing. There are multiple different people who need to be kind of brought in and gathered together to make decisions. But the people who achieve the status to do this are part of certain ancestries, and it's inherited. However, the inheritance is not, like primogenitor or whatever, like the firstborn gets it. The inheritance is still often bestowed. For the Haudenosaunee, for example, it is like clan mothers who bestow the title of political leader to one of their sons of particular ancestries. And this isn't to say that this is exclusive either. It is non-stratified. They have a institution in the Great Law of Peace, referring to, I believe they're called Little Pine Chiefs. At least in the book that I have, that refers to them as that. And these are people who have demonstrated great capacity for leadership. So other leaders can get together and essentially grant them status and elevate them to leadership. What's important here is that these are still egalitarian societies. It is status. It is not a different strata or rank, and everyone is still essentially equal. If someone in a non-stratified society who is in one of these vertical egalitarian societies wants to go to war, for example, like they still have to generate consensus among their the group they have status with, who they are the political leader of. And even then, these societies also tend to be pretty decentralized. So other political leaders and other groups may decide not to do that. So there is a lot of negotiation and consensus building that's involved in these kinds of societies. Meanwhile, more stratified societies also tend to be more concentrated, so the consensus building that does happen tends to be with fewer elites when there is negotiations that have to happen. All right, and now we have, I think this is the second to last one. So let's ask how the polity is spatialized. I don't think I talked about this one too much with Bibbs, so I can go into a little bit more detail here. And, when geographers and stuff talk about territorial polities, this isn't to say that non-territorial polities don't have a territory. They often have an area that they inhabit that, they see themselves as having ownership of. But, I'll get more to that in a moment. So territorial polities all have a fixed space. So they have borders, essentially. Though they may have limited jurisdictions, and this allows other polities to overlap and intersect. There are also situations here where, you may be, and this overlaps with like more hierarchic polities as well, is that they could be territorial and hierarchic. You could have someone who's technically in charge of somebody else, but that other person, but the paramount leader doesn't have jurisdiction in the territory of their subordinate. This is also something that's in more hierarchical societies, where you may have, a bunch of elites. Power is pretty concentrated, and it's still more hierarchic. But they are in one polity, but they have distinct territories that you may also have other institutions that are politically relevant that circulate within that space, whether or not those jurisdictions would like them to be there. Once you get into the rim, so like the 80, 100% steps, you have exclusive territorial polities. This is, Saskia Sassen, who's a political geographer, used the term exclusive territorial polities. And these are polities that have sole authority within their borders. And these borders are fixed and strong. So this is more something that we have now with a lot of contemporary states, whether they're nation states or otherwise. And they've essentially, and these territorial states are also associated with being highly centralized, because, you have few structures with these institutions, and they are able to emanate their jurisdiction throughout the territory. Now, even in exclusive territorial polities, it's always going to be the ability of the state to impose itself is going to be uneven, right? Like it's not going to be totally able to control everything that everyone's doing, but nevertheless, they do have these exclusive territorial polities. And this is also expressed by Weber, for example, with like the monopoly of physical force or the monopoly of violence, where the state is the one that has sole legitimate use of physical force to kind of impose the normative order, which we're going to get to with coercion. So all of these things are linked together. All of these variables are very much codeterminant, right? We talked about being overdetermined and things like that. So certain societies are going to be more state-like. You're going to see a lot of stuff on the cool side, and that's going to kind of work together. These things are not going to be when you plot a polity, it's not going to be wildly all over the place necessarily. All right, and then for the non-territorial polities, we can have a spectrum here. On the one side, these polities are fluid and they're embodied in networks that crisscross and share space. So at the most non-territorial, it is not where you are that determines your polity. It is who you are. So, what groups you belong to is more important. So your politics is more embodied. A lot of these polities may have areas they inhabit, but these boundaries are often be fuzzy. Likewise, in non-territorial polities, most of the land would be seen as more common or more collective. In territorial polities, there may still be commons. You think of England during the Middle Millennium, for example. Enclosure and the removal of the commons and the wastes was a large political struggle that took hundreds of years to unfold. Though those commons were very much established and protected, I believe the Charter of the Forest. Charter of the Forest is one of the big documents for that. The Charter of the Forest was kind of imposed through the hierarchy by the monarchy, right? So you do have, even then, you do have jurisdictions that are kind of imposing these things rather than, as a member of the polity, you are allowed to responsibly, not just you're allowed to responsibly harvest and manage or co-manage the territory, but like that is your subsistence, right? Like that's just what you do. As non-territorial polities get more towards the hub, the 40 and 20%, you start to have these sort of territorial insertions. And this could be something like, there are specific areas within a territory that are titled to specific networks, specific lineages, or specific individuals. Though in those cases, you do tend to see more collective or usufruct property, and you often have arrangements made within the polity for people to use it. So, for example, in a lot of these polities, they are seasonal. They come together. They're seasonal and they come together regularly. And at the times when they come together, one person may have a great fishing spot and another has a wonderful, stand of oak trees to gather acorns from. And when they meet together, one may say, I will gift you the privilege of fishing on my fishing spot. And the other one can say, oh, well, I will gift you the privilege of harvesting acorns in my stand of oak trees. And by doing this, they're both, reaffirming the possessions of one another. They are both also giving access. It's also reciprocal, but they're also confirming their membership within the polity through sharing these resources. And, if somebody happened to use the stand of oak trees to harvest acorns, or they happen to fish at that fishing spot, then usually they'd say, oh, I fished at your fishing spot. I caught 10 fish. Here is your share of the fish. So essentially there is a tax or a rent for using that land. It's not an exclusive claim to a property that prevents other members of the polity from accessing it. Non-territorial polities also make negotiations to share territory, especially where it overlaps. One of the more famous ones of these is the dish with one spoon wampum, or the one dish wampum. This is a treaty agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe, I think, Three Fires, Confederacy. And they made this agreement so that they would share the territories where they overlap. A territorial polity would not do this, though would not willingly do this. There are instances of polity, like states or state-like polities ceding territory for certain amounts of time, usually when they lose a war or something like that. But that is always that is a form of subordination, right? Like that's a kind of humiliation. We think of China, the area of China within the 20th century, in the early, no, in the late 19th century, with the, variety of territories that were ceded to different European powers, and I believe Japan as well, for, a period of time, right? That is not the same as two non-territorial polities agreeing to share territory through treaty. And as another clarification, this isn't to say that these territories aren't defended. The territories of non-territorial polities are often quite large, but they do have fuzzy boundaries and they can overlap, creating kind of buffer zones between them. Between polities that do not create treaties, if there are, if there's a limited amount of food during to a drought or, something like that causes people to have to go further afield for their subsistence, that can cause the boundaries of their polity to become more rigid. And in those buffer zones where they overlap, that is where conflict could emerge between these polities. And historically, in especially the East Coast of North America, that is what we see as a driver of warfare. And the point of the warfare is to push enemy polities out of overlapping territorial claims. And there's a great book about this called The Cutting Off Way of War by Wayne E. Lee, and he discusses warfare in ancestral, so like pre-colonial and then post-colonial Eastern North America, particularly what is now the United States. So I highly recommend that for folks who want to check it out. All right, and then I think this is the last one. This is, how is the normative order maintained? And on the one side, we have coercion. And the other side, we have negotiation. And I think I should change negotiation to consensus, because I think negotiation kind of works as the overlap over the hub. But coercive polities impose the normative order through physical force unilaterally, right? So you have the polities apparatus for governance, and they impose it downward, especially at the more saturated end, so right near the rim, like the 80 and 100% steps. The polity is imposing the normative order to one degree or another. Some of these polities may have ways to essentially debate debate about the application, but it is a top-down unilateral situation. In the most coercive polities, there isn't even room for, normal everyday people to actually resist or complain about the application of physical force to impose the normative order. More negotiated orders, so let's say in the hub area, see more of a bilateral situation where the normative order is has to be negotiated. There has to be a collaboratory exercise. So I mean, on the cool side of the spoke, this would probably be between elites, and there would still be, coercion or the threat of violence involved. Meanwhile, on the warm side, negotiated norms sort of rely on collaboration between the segments of society, and these tend to be bilateral or multilateral engagements. Near the hub, these negotiated orders rely on non-consensus forums, things like majoritarian decisions, and not everyone in that segment would necessarily agree with the decision, but everyone's responsible for upholding it anyway, even if you disagreed. Meanwhile, near the rim, these are highly negotiated normative orders established using consensus. And you say that's non-binding, but the thing is, you as a member are consenting to other people doing it, or you are actively consenting to participate in it. And so, if a decision is come to, so say someone from one segment in society insulted someone from another segment in a highly negotiated normative order, and we have to assume that this would be a kind of insult that would get everyone so upset that they'd have to have a sit down to discuss it. The people from those segments would get together, and both segments would have to come to consensus on a path forward. How do we not restore the situation, but how do we move forward from here? What can be done? So, it may require an apology, or it may require something else. But everybody in those segments who cares enough to participate would have to either actively, consent, or they would have to just passively, like, sure, you can do it if you want. That sounds fine. Yeah, so I think that covers those normative orders. And another thing here is that, like, negotiated normative orders don't preclude the use of physical force, especially in punishment. Many societies that have these kind of consensus multi or bilateral orders may decide that the punishment for breaking the peace is, death, essentially. And this is also very extreme, right? Like it takes a lot to actually get to this situation. But we have to understand where they're coming from. And I think I've gone into this before, but just to re-articulate it, in these societies, you have multiple different groups that must work together in order to reproduce their society. So the polity needs to do everything that it can to de-escalate and maintain productive relationships. Not just like economically productive relationships, but like socially productive relationships. And this is because these different segments, they could be intermarried. They can be parent and child. They'll have worked together, fought together, died together, grow old together, had children together, right? They're often married to one another. And when you have so many different segments that are so integrated, if you have someone from a segment who injures another to such a degree that, like, it makes cooperating together impossible, there needs to be something pretty significant happening in order to continue to have those relationships. Sometimes that could mean moving that person to a different community. So if somebody there's an accidental death, it wasn't on purpose, it was an accident. The community may decide that you have to go live somewhere else. You can go live with, extended relatives in a different kin group, but you can't stay here. You may be able to come back at some point, but you cannot stay here in order for this situation, like this polity to continue. But people can do things that are so detrimental that their continued existence threatens the normative order of the polity. And so, I always think there's a thesis that I've read that talks about the legal orders of the Gitsan, and there's an example of this where a husband who was from one clan group murdered his wife, who's from another clan group, and the husband's clan group, in negotiation, well, what ended up happening was that a member of the wife's clan group ended up killing the husband, and the Canadian state dispatched people to investigate, and they hit a brick wall essentially because no one was willing to talk to them. But what seems to have happened is that the members of the husband's clan group essentially said, okay, the wife's clan group, you can take him out, right? Like, we are cutting him loose. This kind of, and that retribution was necessary in order for the society to continue to function. Societies that have this kind of highly negotiated consensus order are kind of driven by the "come get your boy" principle, because and they do try to knit together as many different networks as possible in order for this kind of de-escalation and maintenance of the normative order to happen. And in the absence of all of these different overlapping networks to strengthen the "come get your boy" principle, this is when coercion steps in. And often it's on purpose. More coercive orders, more centralized orders get rid of all of these different networks, or they incorporate them within the structures of governance, the centralized structures of governance, and use them for their own purposes. So, when we think about policing in states today, think about settler states like Canada and the United States, or like, contemporary European states. I mean, the modern notion of policing, which developed in Western Central Europe a few hundred years ago, has since spread around the world due to, the spread of certain ideas about what the state means and what it should be. So, policing is pretty common. The kinds of policing we have is pretty common today, is, kind of comes from the same place. And, in order for that to work, they do need to dismantle other forms of legal order or normative order, more polycentric legal orders. That's what's referred to in the scholarship, and creating this more monologic normative or legal order that can be imposed through coercive polities. So, if you ask, in the absence of police, what happens? Well, people create an abundance of different ways to relate to one another in order to maintain the normative order within their own groups. So, yes. Yeah, I think that's good. All right. So, just some notes before I move on to some examples. These axes, as I mentioned before, are all interconnected. For example, concentrated power aligns with more hierarchic polities, stratified societies that centralize power. More diffuse societies tend to be more anarchic and decentralized and non-stratified. Societies that rely on negotiation also tend to be more diffuse and more anarchic. So these things are all connected. Polities are more likely to be more cool or warm on this chart when they're plotted, especially if they rely, if some of the axes are more towards one of the rims. So, if you have a centralized polity that's on the rim of centralized everything else is going to be on the cool side too, most likely. The hub of the chart, so the inner three, the inner three spots, so the 20, 40, and 60%, you can see more variation. I mean, towards the 60%, it's more likely that, if you have something like 60% non-stratified, maybe you could have 10% centralized or something, 20% centralized or something like that, or, maybe a little concentrated or a little territorial, right? So they're not, the warm and the cool side are not exclusive, but the more that you are closer to the rim, the more it kind of pulls. Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to move into the examples. And the examples here are all for one region. That region is where is it? It's in the Eastern Peninsula. It's going to be, you know what? I've got, I'll just bring it up. Okay, here we go. So the Wingless are located over here. They are in all of the sort of alluvial, mangrovey, like the alluvial kind of mangrove-esque forests in here. There are a lot of river systems and deltas coming through here. This area is slowly being filled in. I think they extend here as well. They're largely in a AW climate regime that they have here, because in the summer you've got precipitation coming in from this way, but in the winter the precipitation is coming over these mountains here, so you've got a rain shadow in this area. But this is where the Wingless are. They refer to themselves as the Wingless because in their origin story they are dragons that lost their wings for some reason. I'm sure there are multiple reasons. Maybe a trick was played on them. Maybe they did something to annoy the other dragons. What's important here is that two things. Dovians have more grayish skin tones. And there are gray dragons, and while most gray dragons are herbivores, some of them are omnivores, and the humans have, the Dovians, the legally distinct humans there, see themselves in the kind of kinship relationship with that group of dragons in particular. And keep in mind, in Arukia, the other mammaliforms, so the monotrematiforms, look quite distinct, right? They have the kind of facial masks and beaks. So compared to the monotrematiforms, the Arukian dracoforms kind of look more mammalian, especially because they don't have beaks, like our contemporary avians do. All right. And I'm going to spend some time running through these and detailing how their society works, just because everything else builds from it. So they are egalitarian hunter-horticulturalists. They spend their summers doing horticulture, gardening, and permaculture plots organized around settlements. These settlements are usually near water, and they're at the intersection of a bunch of different ecosystems, primarily, different freshwater ecosystems and terrestrial ecosystems. In the dry season, they are, hunter foragers, and they go out from the settlements into their respective clan territories. So a member of these societies belongs to their own clan, as well as a settlement where they live. The clans are divided into subclans, and those subclans make up neighborhoods in the settlements. So the subclan is a very important segment, group in the society. People are also born into moieties. There is a left and a right moiety. Each moiety also has two sections, section 1 and section 2, or the first and second section. Everyone is also born into an age set. And that age set is a group of people who are within 8 years of each other. And that age set moves through 8 grades. So there are 2 youth grades, and that would take someone to being around 16 years old. And then there are middle grades. Those are the adult grades, and that would take someone from being 17 to 44. Yeah, 17 to 44. The youngest one is kind of the fledge grade. At one point during that, people tend to be partnered, married. And then there are 3 upper grades, and those upper grades are for elders. So you have youth, adults, and elders. Land is common to the clan, and it is collectively owned. So everyone in the clan, the clans are usually made up of 3 or more subclans. And let me just check something here. How many people are in each of these? So yeah, clans are composed of subclans, and they usually have a few hundred members through a few hundred adult members. The subclans themselves are broken up into lineages, and there's usually a handful of lineages in each subclan. Each lineage has, a dozen to a few dozen adult members in it. So, the clans can vary in size. You can have some clans that are quite small and have, maybe 120 adult members that have small subclans and small lineages. You can also have very large clans that are composed of many subclans that can have many lineages. And it's going to kind of depend on the availability of resources, the amount of people in an area, the number of clans in an area, those sorts of things. There are certain plots or sites that are in the clan land. Those are delegated to specific lineages and held by an individual. These sites out on the range are designated as either left or right. So someone of that moiety, the left moiety or the right moiety, inherits. Has to be the one who is delegated that site. So if you had a stand of prickle trees, and every summer every dry season in the winter, every dry season in the winter, they come to that copse of trees, that stand of trees, and they harvest a certain number of prickle fruits from it. They also hunt and harvest a certain number of yellow-crested blues from it. That lineage is responsible for that, and there's an individual who kind of manages that harvesting to make sure it's not over-harvested and to make sure that it's well taken care of. There could be another site. Maybe it is a sacred site, a significant natural feature, and that could be identified with the right moiety. So somebody who is part of the right moiety would be responsible for it. As I mentioned, there are 2 sections. The first section is the section that stays in the clan. So when 2 people are partnered, they must partner with someone of the opposite moiety. So if you're in the left moiety, you have to partner with someone from the right moiety. And they also have to be of the opposite section. If you're in section 1, you stay in your clan. If you're in section 2, you leave your clan. When a partnered couple has children, the children of the opposite sex inherit their section. So if you have a L1 mother and an R2 father, then the children are going to inherit the moiety from the second section parent. So in this case, they're both going to be right. So you're going to have an R2. You're going to have an R2 daughter and an R1 son. And how this works going back and forth means that if someone is the L1 and they have the stand of trees, they can't, like, you could not pass it down to your next section 1 child because they are going to be of an opposite moiety. So this kind of ensures that, or it strongly organizes against the inheritance. Delegations, when you delegate it, a plot to someone, it can also be taken away if they're not doing a good job. And people can also be assigned different sites. So, if someone's growing older, so say a big important kind of site in the rangelands are the campsites. So this is where people spend their winter seasons, usually as a subclan. They'll winter in the same spot together, and maintaining these sites and managing them is the responsibility of a particular lineage within the subclan, and that'll be held by someone. Those are particularly important positions. When that person passes on, maybe they will then give it to someone who has proven that they can responsibly manage other sites. So our L1 woman who we had before, who was managing these copse of prickle trees with the yellow-crested blues, if she is recognized as doing a good job at that, maybe she's the one who gets assigned to manage the L1 site, the one of the winter camping sites, or one of the winter sites for the subclan. Both the settlements and the clans have consensus assemblies with councils where all adults participate. In the winters, these are clan assemblies. In the summers, these would be the settlement assemblies. These are organized through age set. So each age set delegates members from the set to speak on their behalf at the assemblies. And that is for the 3 adult grades. The 3 adult grades have delegates who report essentially what their age sets, they report what their age sets have agreed on, more or less. And then there are the 3 elder grades, and they delegate members to be a part of a council that advises the assembly. And people who are part of left and right participate equally. People who are part of first and second sections also participate equally. An important part of this is that when a decision is made in the society, the duties that are assigned are often cycled based on moiety and set. And these are also broken down between like the settlement and the neighborhoods, which are subclans. And then on the range, it would be broken down by the clan, either into moieties and sets or into subclan moieties and sets. So like an example of this is, if somebody hears that a golden-tailed green dragon is mourning, that would mean that a dragon storm is going to happen. And now, a local, the local resident golden-tailed green union can live a long time, especially large dragons like the golden-tailed greens. They're quite long-lived. So people in the assembly may not have lived to experience the last one, but people from the councils could have. So they would advise the assembly on what to do. And then the assembly could say, okay, well, while the dragon storm's going on, each of the subclans is going to be responsible for posting guards to ensure that nobody goes into the range where these golden-tailed greens are going to be fighting one another. And each of the subclans is going to choose who is going to be standing guard, so people don't accidentally, wander into the range. And maybe they'll say, the daytime shift is handled by the left moiety, and the nighttime shift is handled by the right moiety. And each of the age sets and each of the subclans can delegate who they want to do it, every day. And then that would cycle until the Dragon Storm is over. So by breaking down responsibility for the decisions that are made to maintain the normative order, they are cycling these sorts of responsibilities throughout the polity. It's not the responsibility of one group in order to do it. But this would also be things like, the subclans have their garden plots near the settlement, and they would organize different tasks based on age grade and based on moiety as well. So they'd constantly be cycling these things. Disputes are also settled through overlapping institutions. If a conflict happens within a subclan, then usually it's the lineages that are going to be sorting it out. But even if you're within a subclan and there's a dispute, they could be happening between different age grades. They could be happening between different sections. It could be a section 1, a section 2. It could be happening between different moieties. And all of those different institutions are going to be involved in settling disputes and in maintaining the peace. So from that, I've kind of mapped things out here. So they are pretty non-territorial, though they do have these insertions that people are responsible for, the plots that I mentioned. They're quite diffuse. They have a lot of these different systems. So they are diffuse, like everybody is participating in political decision making. Everyone's participating in discussions. Maybe the anarchic needs to be more anarchic and less diffuse, because it is specifically the adults in 3 age grades who are making decisions with the advice of the Council of Elders. So, I think these should be kind of swapped a bit. They are quite anarchic, where all of these different groups, like the settlements and the clans, the subclans, they are maybe nestled inside each other, but they are also, equally important and interact somewhat horizontally, even if they are nested. They are quite decentralized. All of these different institutions for governing things are broken up into different networks. They're quite non-stratified. We do have different privileges here for grades. So, people are responsible for different things. There's also, while everybody is kind of doing the same stuff, and people do things together based on grade. So in many societies where roles may be distributed, even in egalitarian societies, like roles may be distributed by gender, for these folks, they distribute roles through grade. So different grades. So if you're in grade 3, which would be people, they're between 16 and 24. Those folks would be, put in charge of doing a specific thing. And they would all be doing it together. And people who are better at doing that one thing or the other thing would take the lead on doing those things. But they would be doing it all together. And this is inspired by certain cultures who have a similar logic. And then negotiation. As I mentioned before, they've got disputes that are dealt with through all these overlapping institutions. It is a multilateral system, and it's based on consensus. Now, this is the example of a wingless society that is vertically egalitarian. So everyone is materially equal. However, hosting subclan lineages, so the ones that are responsible for those winter campsites, are inheriting the status of those titles. And it is members of those hosting lineages that are also delegated to represent age grades or the age sets in the assemblies. So we do have some more stratification here in that only certain groups are like politically delegated to represent, as well as having the privilege of being responsible for of sites. Members still belong to the clans, moieties, sections, age groups, and settlements. So, it's still pretty decentralized. The land is still common and collectively owned. But as I mentioned, those plots are delegated to members of specific lineages. So, if you have a subclan and that subclan has 3 or 4 lineages, one of those lineages or 2 of those lineages may be the inheriting lineages. And then the settlements and clans still have these consensus assemblies, but it is the delegated members of those hosting lineages who participate. However, they're still delegated, and there's still consensus involved. So it is the age set in a specific grade that is saying, you are the one who is going to be representing us. And if they do a bad job, then they can pull it back. Councils have an important role in essentially ratifying the choices, especially for the clans, in who gets to be responsible for certain sites. So, this is not, if somebody is delegated a plot, they don't get it for life. They can have it taken away if they're poorly managing it. And same as before, responsibilities and duties are cycled and assigned based on the moiety. So we can see that like the non-territoriality is the same as before. I did shift it back a slide, but they become less diffuse. And this is because you have the host lineages that are participating. They are, less anarchic, because again, they are now vertically egalitarian, sort of heterarchic society. They are less decentralized because you are starting to centralize some of these institutions within specific lineages within the subclan. They are less non-stratified, and again, that's due to the vertical egalitarianism. There are still materially they are equal. It's just certain lineages are going to be the ones who are making decisions, and they are still consensus-based, though they're moving closer to the hub because it is going to be these hosting lineages that are the ones that are like negotiating for all of these different sets. So before, you may have had a bunch of people, representing, the moieties and the sections and the subclans and the age sets all coming together. But now it would just be members from these host lineages who fall into those categories. So you do see less of a multilateral situation. Well, yeah, more of a yeah. Now this is a more heterarchic system, and this is one with a clandom. So you have the clans, and they have confederated. So you have a confederated clandom, and it is made up of, so there's multiple clans, they've confederated together, and the clans have priority over the settlements. Hosting lineages now extract rents from guest lineages during the winter, and hosting lineages tend to spend most of their time on the range. So in a subclan, you're going to have host lineages and guest lineages. The host lineages are the ones that are inheriting those sites out in the range. And for the guests to be able to use those sites, they are going to have to pay rents. And those rents can be, we will work garden plots for you in the settlements, and we will give you those things in order to access the range. People are still born into their clans and their subclans, their sections, their age sets in their settlements. However, moieties are less relevant, so they are important for marriage practices because it's taboo to marry someone of the same moiety. It's also taboo to marry someone from your own subclan. But they don't use moieties for governance or for delineating tasks and those sorts of things anymore. Now, sections also have distinct roles. As I mentioned before, Section 1 is the inheriting section. It's also the section that stays in the clan. Section 2 leaves the clan. The people who leave the clan, Section 2, start being associated more specifically with settlement life, and they start being associated more with working the plots, with maintaining the neighborhoods in the settlements, and with kind of domestic life, quote unquote. So the land is still collectively owned by the clans, but the plots are now inherited by the hosting lineage. The land's not common anymore. The clandom and the clans have assemblies with councils where all the hosting members participate. However, settlement assemblies, while they do continue, they're disempowered, so they're not making political choices anymore. All the political choices are being made by clan assemblies or assemblies of the confederated clans. The hosting lineages don't really participate in the settlement assemblies, but the settlement assemblies aren't deciding anything politically important. Like they're doing things like, maintaining relationships between the guest lineages who live there. They are coordinating infrastructure work. They're coordinating like festivals and ritual days and that kind of thing. So it's like very administrative in like maintenance work. It's not the kind of political work that they used to be doing. And rather by assigning things based on age set and moiety, now things are explicitly like set and subclan. And we can see that, the society has shifted. It used to be that these two were all in the warm side of the wheel. Now they're in the cool side of the wheel. They're still non-territorial, and they still rely on negotiation, though it is, becoming more concentrated and more exclusionary. However, you still need the guest lineages to agree. This is not in a place where the elites of the hosting lineage are like imposing things through coercion necessarily. Or, maybe they're one skip on the other side. This is, again, this is a first draft. This is a work in progress. I think, next time I go around this, I'll have it hammered in a bit better. Right. The power is much more concentrated now. It is not, now it is these people are concentrating power among themselves to these lineages, and they are not, necessarily accountable for those sorts of political decisions to the guest lineages. They are more centralized, so they have gotten rid like a lot of the important political things that were happening were split between the clan and the settlements. That's not the thing anymore. Now it is all being centralized into the clan, and the settlements are essentially like interclan organizations rather than their own distinct distinct organizations with institutions. They're also more stratified now. So, the kind of guest relationships that we had in the vertical egalitarian system are now like extractive relationships. I think I covered all of those. Oh yeah, and it's also more hierarchic. So you do have this kind of top down imposition now. And they're kind of on the other end of the heterarchy kind of spectrum here compared to the vertically egalitarian ones. But rather than, and the reason why it's more on the negotiation side is also like their power is very fragmented, right? So these are all elites, they would kind of have the capacity to be coercive. However, because there are multiple different lineages, which, are still relatively close materially, they can't wield coercive power. So they're still in a bilateral situation. So they do still have to negotiate and collaborate, but they do not need consensus anymore. These are, more majoritarian decisions made by a smaller group of people. So now we have a hierarchic clandom of hunter horticulturalists, and so this is where the wingless, these confederated clansdoms, create a leadership position. And what I've been thinking about is that during a series of kind of consistent warfare, they elect a military leader. They give title to a military leader, and that military leader goes to ritual sites throughout the confederated clandom and performs certain rituals to grant from the tutelary, like the guardian spirits, to grant them boons to be successful. And someone who has done that and was very successful kind of cemented that position, and it was able to be inherited through their Section 1 line. So they have ritual and military significance, but they are not necessarily the politically predominant force in the confederated clandom. So they still have to negotiate a lot with the other, with the hosting lineages. So now we have a situation which is more hierarchic, where the hosting lineages are extracting rents from guest lineages who live on the range, and then the leader extracts rents from the hosts. And this is ostensibly for, having both the military campaigns, but also the leader of the confederated clandom is constantly moving through the clandom's territory. And in order to do this, they need resources in order to kind of sustain this very mobile lifestyle. Members belong to the clans, their sections, their age sets, and their settlements. As I mentioned before, sections have distinct roles, and these are now quite cemented and distinct, where Section 1 is dominant and Section 2 is subordinate. Again, moieties are much less relevant. It's just sort of a cultural thing for marriage at this point. And these are, the clandom now is more territorial. So they do have like a fixed territory. However, there are overlapping jurisdictions. So you've got, the confederated clan leader, and then you've got the hosting lineage leaders. They have overlapping jurisdictions for different things and sometimes similar things within the same fixed territory. And their territories have become more fixed due to the kind of warfare that they've been experiencing. The estates on the range are inherited by the hosting lineages, and the territory is no longer collective. It is now specifically belonging to host lineages and, more explicitly, the leader of the confederated clandom. So the clandom as a whole and the clans have assemblies with councils where the host members participate, particularly the titled host members or someone that they send in their stead. Settlement assemblies continue, but are disempowered and entirely administrative. And then when duties are assigned, they're cycled based on subclan and set. So we can see how this society is much more concentrated, slightly more territorial. This one is now distinctly coercive. The the political power in the society and the ability to, wield violence to impose it sits with the hosting lineage elites as well as with the Confederated clan leader, and it is imposed down onto guest lineages. However, between the hosting lineages and the Confederate clan leader, there's still bilateral exchange going on there. It's much more stratified, as I mentioned. Now we have an extra layer here, and there's more distance between the hosting lineages and the guest lineages. The guest lineages now have, very little access to land and, material. And they are much more reliant on paying rents to the hosting lineages to get the things that they need. They're more centralized now, and we now have, this pyramids have been established, which is why they are more hierarchic than before. And yeah, clearly they're more concentrated because now they have fewer members in power, and they also have, a sort of paramount figure. And then finally, we have a sort of early citizen state hunter horticulturalists. And here, the kind of situation here is that there could have been a couple things going on, but one thing that tends to happen is, you can have, so maybe some of the wingless societies become more hierarchic, and in response to these more stratified heterarchies and hierarchies, some groups say, okay, well, we can't go there. Let's move in a different direction. And some may try to maintain the sort of vertical egalitarianism that they have, and others may try to overthrow their heterarchies or hierarchies. And this is a bit of a common thing that we see. Or you could have, one of these vertical egalitarian societies decide to centralize in response to these more hierarchical systems. Not hierarchical systems, sorry. To these more concentrated systems. Yeah, I should say more concentrated systems. So there are still some elite lineages. They are no longer hosting lineages, but they do live on the range. These would have been inheriting hosting lineages that sided with the formation of the state in opposition. Maybe these were weaker hosting lineages that had a lot to gain by siding with the state and the guest lineages, and there were, and they guessed right in whatever civil conflict unfolded. Members belong to the settlement, neighborhood, moiety, section, and age set. Clans have been abolished, essentially. But all of these things, your neighborhood, which used to be your subclan, moiety, section, and age set, are all co-opted by the state, and they're all organized by the state. Section 2 is largely excluded from politics. So the Section 2 is the subordinate kind of, gender in the society with the role that they have. Of course, not gender marked by relation to sex, but gender marked by relation to their section and their moiety. And Section 1 is participating in politics. Settlements are divided into neighborhoods, and the rangelands are delegated by settlement to neighborhoods every year. So, they have essentially different districts of the rangeland. These rangelands would have been seized from the clans. And for the winter, they delegate which neighborhood gets to go where. And it could be rotated, for example. They do a similar thing with the horticultural plots where they're like, okay, well, how many people do you have living in your neighborhood? How much horticultural land do you need? All right, so this is how much you get, essentially. Ranges are inherited by elites, and, in exchange for that, elites are just kind of out there monitoring it against other states or against these hierarchies that are located nearby, these confederated clandoms. And the elites also make up, an elite form of infantry in warfare. And I guess when the Capals show up, the elites would be primarily situated to be cavalry. How these states are organized around a paramount settlement. And so you have the main settlement where the state governance and assembly happens, and then you have satellite settlements. Most of these satellite settlements would have been like emptied out in a way. So the paramount settlement would have grown in size. This is like the emptying of the hinterlands, and this tends to happen when you get when you get more statelight and you see more like aggressive urbanization, you tend to see an emptying out of the hinterlands and populations being more concentrated. So the state assembly has its own council, and that's where all the politics is happening. Members of Section 1 participate, and they organize it so that, all of the left-handed moiety members participating are sitting on one side, and all the right-handed ones are sitting on the other side. Left and right is associated with hands, but not handedness. Okay. And the people who are delegated to speak are decided as before through age set and grade. There are subordinate like neighborhood assemblies, and there are also satellite settlement assemblies, but these are also more administrative, and power flows, their sovereignty and jurisdiction flows down to them from the state assembly. And then finally, the responsibilities and duties that need to happen are coordinated through neighborhoods, and they're cycled based on moiety and set. This is much more similar to the vertically egalitarian and the egalitarian system. And for these settlement and satellite settlement tasks, they're divided up based on sections. So Section 1 does certain things, Section 2 does other things, and elites often don't participate in these duties, right? Like they may participate in the politics of the state, but they are not, like they're out on the territory, and they show up for assemblies and meetings, and then they go back onto the territory into their specific estates. And we can see that, they are also very much like the hierarchic system. They are up in the cool side, but they have different characteristics. So their society is less stratified. We do have the stratification based on section that I've been talking about. We also have elites, like there are clear elites. So there is like some material difference there, but it's not as significant as under the hierarchy. We also have, it is a coercive society, but it is less coercive than the hierarchy. And this is something that we see with states that emerge in response to certain hierarchic situations, right? They allow people to seize back some of their autonomy from some of these more concentrated structures. And the system also doesn't have like policing in any meaningful way. So, the coercion that is applied is still negotiated and bilateral. We also have, it is a less concentrated society. I mean, everybody who is part of Section 1, who is an adult, who is in one of the adult age grades can participate, and people who have participated as an adult in those age grades can then, go on to be a part of the council and advise. And the council probably has a customary authority that the assembly tends to listen to, kind of like a Senate situation in Rome, that sort of thing. They're also much more territorial. They have abolished the clandom. They have gotten rid of these different circulating jurisdictions, and they have become sort of an exclusive territorial authority. They are about as hierarchic as the confederated clandom with the leader, but they're hierarchic in different ways. As we saw, the settlement is at the top, and there are satellite settlements. So, they've just reorganized how they are doing hierarchy for different outputs. And they are much more centralized as well. So they have centralized all, sort of political governance into this state structure. That's not dispersed among all these different semi-autonomous like hosting lineages and all that kind of stuff. They've brought it all together. Yeah, so that is kind of running through some examples as to how I was using it. And like, this is not like my attempt with this is not to kind of quantify these different things. Like, this is more of a qualitative scale, I suppose. And what I hope is that the chart and kind of thinking about plotting polities on the chart can help kind of break out some common assumptions about polities and world building polities. As I mentioned before, this is a work in progress. This is kind of the first draft. A mutual mind on Discord made a radar chart. And, I think a radar chart may be better, but I do like, so like in a radar chart, it would be a hexagon and it would be inner and outer. I do like this chart because it also has all of the, it's labeled differently. I mean, I'm sure I could come up with like a labeling system. And one thing too, I do think there are too many steps. I think maybe 3 steps that are a bit broader could work better. That was something I was thinking about, and I could have a bit more of like a detailed vibe for what each step is. The other thing is I want to kind of rearrange the axes to show which things are more connected. So for example, coercion and concentration are more closely aligned. Territorialization and centralization are more closely aligned, and then hierarchy and stratification are closely aligned. So I think I'll reorganize it along the top from west northwest, starting at west northwest, and then moving over. Have coercion, concentration, stratification, hierarchic, centralized, and then territorial. I think that would work a bit better. I also think it would help to communicate what warm and cool spokes are more exclusionary, because like if a society is more hierarchical or more stratified, I think I wanted to make those the coolest. So the coolest colors are the ones north, so blue and cyan. So those are the coolest ones. Meanwhile, the warmest ones are red and orange. So making red and orange anarchic and non-stratified could help say, it's like, okay, those pull everything warmer. Meanwhile, plotting closer to the rim of hierarchic and stratified pulls everything cooler. Meanwhile, stratified, territorial, concentrated, and coercion don't pull things into the cool or warm side as much. And while we do see certain tendencies where these things are a bit more connected, it would be interesting to say, oh, well, you can have a society that's, anarchic and also centralized. What would that look like? Someone could develop a polity that kind of fulfill these things. What about a society, that is, more, I don't know, like non-stratified, but also more concentrated, or non-stratified but more hierarchic? Like what does that look like? I mean, you wouldn't have one that's 100% non-stratified and then 60% hierarchic. I don't think you could justify that, but something that's 60% non-stratified and 20% hierarchic or something like that. Like what would these societies look like? And I think that this can kind of prompt that. So we are, where are we? Like an hour and 45 minutes. That's almost as long as Alive. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me today to this pre-recorded live. Next week, I should have another pre-recorded live with thoughts about kingdoms and empires. That'll probably be a shorter one. I don't think I have any slides or anything for that. It'll probably just be what is it? It'll probably just be a recording of all the of me painting something in Procreate or something like that. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, again, thank you so much for joining me for Lands Unknown. If you haven't already, like and subscribe. And you can always join the Patreon. If you join the Patreon for free, you can get regular updates on what I'm doing on YouTube. But if you become a paid member, you get access to monthly updates. And in those updates, you get sneak peeks, as well as a bunch of housekeeping stuff about the schedule and what I have planned. And if you subscribe to one of the higher tiers, you can also vote on one of the videos that comes out every year, as well as early access to the videos by, as much as a week in advance. Yeah, thank you everyone so much. And I will see you pre-recorded next week. We are back doing normal lives on April 19th, once the end of the term is over and I'm done all the marking I need to do. So yeah, thanks everyone, and I'll see you next time.